The moment I pushed open the heavy carved doors to my street Helena estate after an exhausting 14-hour shift managing the harvest at Oakstone Winery, a wave of sickening smells hit me dead on. The heavy, greasy scent of cheap fast food burgers, bleach, and damp laundry hung thick in the air. My main villa floor was littered with peanut husks, and out on the veranda, damp baby blankets were draped over $1,200 French oak wine barrels. Elizabeth was pointing toward my master bedroom, declaring with an authoritative bark that my brother-in-law and his wife were moving into my 4,000-square-foot villa for at least a year. When I asked who gave them permission to rearrange my home, my husband Christopher walked right up to me and slapped me hard across the face, splitting my lip before shouting, "Watch your mouth! Look at me!" If you want to see how Samantha turns her husband's greed into his absolute downfall, subscribe now and hit the notification bell for Chapter 2. I stood completely frozen in the foyer as the sharp copper taste of blood filled my mouth. For 5 years, I had tolerated the relentless boundary pushing from Christopher's family. I told myself it was my duty as a supportive wife to smooth over every conflict, to absorb every snide comment from my mother-in-law Elizabeth, and to overlook the endless financial handouts to his younger brother Tyler. When Tyler got married to Ashley and chronically failed at every business venture he attempted, I was the one who quietly wired cash to keep them afloat. I believed that if I gave enough, if I was patient enough, they would eventually see my worth and accept me as part of their inner circle. Looking back now, I realize that my patience was never seen as grace. It was interpreted as weakness. When an individual grows up trying to earn love in an environment where acceptance is conditional, they develop a survival response centered on overfunctioning and compliance. I spent half a decade bending over backward, convincing myself that keeping the peace was worth sacrificing my own dignity. But peace that requires your self-destruction is not peace at all. It is simply a slow, quiet surrender. That surrender ended the microsecond Christopher's palm made contact with my cheekbone. The force of his strike sent my shoulder slamming into the drywall, rattling the framed vintage wine labels on the wall. Beside the leather sectional, Tyler didn't even stop chewing his $30 imported table grapes. Ashley merely rested her hand over her pregnant stomach, a triumphant smirk flashing across her face before she feigned a delicate shudder. Elizabeth folded her arms over her chest, nodding in severe approval, as if an unruly child had finally been given a long overdue lesson. I didn't scream. I didn't break down into hysterics or collapse onto the $5,000 Persian rug they had just ruined with peanut shells. I slowly raised my hand, pressing my fingers against the corner of my mouth. When I pulled my hand back, my palm was smeared with crimson. Christopher stood over me, his chest heaving, smelling strongly of cheap draft beer. His face was flushed, driven by a fragile ego that couldn't handle the truth. "Look at me, Samantha," he growled, stepping closer to loom over me. "My mother said they need this place for Ashley's postpartum recovery. You make insane money as the operations director. You spend half your life at the winery anyway. This estate is big enough for everyone, and as your husband, I decide who stays under this roof." I looked at him, then at Elizabeth, who was still clutching her steel tape measure after auditing my glass-enclosed wine tasting room to convert it into a nursery. I pulled my leather briefcase closer to my side. Inside sat the original premarital trust folder created by my parents before our wedding, the deed that proved this 15-acre street. Helena property was bought outright in my name alone, with zero marital funds ever touching its title. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy coldness settle into my veins. "I am not refusing to help Ashley," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "I can write a cashier's check for $4,000 a month right now to reserve a private, luxury postpartum suite at the Street Helena Women's Health Center. It has full nursing staff, sterile private rooms, and catered meals. It is the best environment for a newborn." Elizabeth's face contorted into something demonic. "A health center?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You think you can just throw your pocket change at us to kick my family to the curb? You look down on us because you went to an Ivy League school and earn a high salary. This estate belongs to Christopher because he is your husband." Christopher glared at me, his eyes bloodshot. "You hear my mom? Stop acting like an arrogant tyrant over a piece of paper. Family comes first. Hand over the keys to the master suite tomorrow morning so Tyler and Ashley can settle in." I lowered my head, hiding the absolute void in my eyes. I wiped the smear of blood from my chin with the back of my hand and offered a faint, obedient smile. "You are right, Christopher," I murmured softly. "I have been too focused on my corporate career. I will clear out my personal items from the master bedroom by sunrise so Ashley can have the space." Elizabeth sniffed arrogantly, completely fooled by my sudden submission. "See? Sometimes a woman just needs to be reminded of her place. Make sure you hire deep cleaners tomorrow morning, too. I don't want my grandson breathing in dust." I didn't answer. I turned on my heel and walked down the hallway toward the master suite. Every step felt weightless. The woman who had spent 5 years trying to buy their affection had died on the foyer floor. What stood in her place was an executive preparing an execution order. Once inside the master bedroom, I deadbolted the heavy door behind me. I didn't cry. I walked straight into the bathroom, opened a bottle of rubbing alcohol, and dabbed the open cut on my lip. The burning sting made my hand flinch for a fraction of a second, but my face remained entirely still in the mirror reflection. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and accessed the local storage drive linked to our cellar corridor. Nest security camera. The 4K video feed from an hour ago was crystal clear. The footage captured Elizabeth ordering furniture to be dragged around, Tyler raiding my wine fridge, my attempt to offer a $4,000 health center check, Christopher storming in, and the exact frame where his hand struck my jaw with violent force. I exported the entire unedited file into an encrypted cloud folder titled Domestic Violence Christopher Oakstone. At 11:30 p.m., as the sound of my in-laws celebrating with my private wine collection echoed faintly down the hallway, I picked up my phone and dialed my family's longtime attorney, Richard. He answered on the third ring, his voice sharp despite the late hour. "Samantha, what's wrong?" he asked immediately. "Uncle Richard," I said, staring at the bruised reflection in the glass. "I need an emergency contested divorce filed first thing tomorrow morning, along with a temporary restraining order and an immediate freeze on all joint financial access." There was a heavy pause on the line before Richard spoke, his tone shifting into pure legal steel. "Did he lay a hand on you, kiddo?" "Yes," I replied quietly, "and I have 4K video footage of the entire thing." "Gather your trust papers, your passport, and your personal documents," Richard instructed. "Come to my office in downtown Napa at 10 a.m. He has zero claim to that estate under California trust law. We will burn his whole world down." I hung up the phone, set it gently on the desk, and looked out the window at the dark, rolling hills of the Napa Valley. My life in this house was over, but the nightmare for the people celebrating in my living room was only just beginning. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the heavy wooden door to the master suite remained locked, sealing me off from the raucous laughter echoing down the corridor. My cheek throve with a dull, rhythmic ache under the cold compress, but my mind had never been sharper. I opened my corporate laptop, the bright blue light illuminating the dark room. Sitting in my flagged inbox was an email from Meredith, our global operations director. It was an executive transfer offer to serve as managing director of operations at a prestigious Premier Grand Cru wine estate in Bordeaux, France. The offer featured a $350,000 compensation package, full international visa sponsorship, and luxury corporate housing in Paris. When Meredith first floated the position 2 weeks ago, I had hesitated. I had spent hours agonizing over how moving to Europe would impact my marriage, worrying if Christopher would feel emasculated, or if Elizabeth would slander me as an ungrateful workaholic. I had willingly put my own ambitions on hold to protect the fragile ego of a man who didn't even hesitate to strike me across the face in front of his family. But as I stared at the glowing screen, touching the swollen cut on my lip, the fog completely cleared. I signed the electronic contract, typed a brief reply to Meredith, requesting the earliest first-class flight out of San Francisco, and hit send. At 1:30 a.m., I dialed Caldwell, a high-end real estate broker in Napa Valley who had been bugging me for months to list my property. He picked up on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep. I cut straight to the point. I told him I was liquidating my 15-acre Street Helena estate immediately. The property was valued at $2.8 million, but I instructed him to list it on a secret, 24-hour cash fire sale for $1.8 million. My only condition was absolute confidentiality, zero buyer contingencies, and a guaranteed wire transfer within 24 hours. Caldwell gasped, realizing the insane opportunity, and promised to lock in an international cash buyer sitting on escrow funds before sunrise. By 2:15 a.m., I logged into Chase Online Banking to execute the financial purge. For 5 years, my hard-earned income had been treated like a communal pot for parasites. I permanently canceled the secondary platinum card Christopher carried in his wallet, which had a $25,000 credit limit. I deleted the recurring monthly bank transfer of $2,500 that automatically went into Elizabeth's account every single month. Finally, I submitted an urgent corporate report to fleet management, revoking Christopher's authorization to drive the company-leased luxury Range Rover and requesting an immediate vehicle repossession. Every digital button I clicked snapped another link in the invisible chain that had bound me to this toxic family. When an individual earns a high salary and continually covers the living expenses of entitled relatives, an insidious dynamic takes root. The in-laws stop viewing the support as a generous gift and begin treating it as an absolute right. They normalize the parasitic exploitation, convincing themselves that the earner's wealth is communal property while their own obligations remain zero. The only way to break this cruel normalization is to introduce a sudden, catastrophic financial liability, forcing them to confront the stark reality of their own emptiness. At 7 o'clock the next morning, I stepped out of the master suite. I was wearing a tailored cream Armani power suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, flawless bun. Heavy professional concealer masked the purple bruise on my left cheekbone, but I carried myself with absolute, untouchable authority. In the main living room, Elizabeth, Tyler, and Ashley were lounging around the glass coffee table, eating breakfast and casually discussing which guest rooms they were going to claim. I set a thick stack of legal documents onto the table. I kept my voice smooth as silk, telling them that after reflecting overnight, I realized my modern ego had created an unhealthy power dynamic. To restore family harmony, I explained that I had drafted paperwork for a quitclaim deed to transfer the sole title of the $2.8 million estate entirely into Christopher's name. Elizabeth's eyes lit up with unadulterated greed. She immediately grabbed a Mont Blanc pen from my desk organizer and shoved it into Christopher's hand, screaming at him to sign it before I changed my mind. Christopher swaggered over, grinning arrogantly as he hovered the pen a millimeter over the signature line. "Wait," I said softly, raising a finger. "Just remember Clause 4. Accepting the sole transfer of this deed means you legally subrogate the $1.2 million home equity line of credit pulled against the estate for a failed private wine futures fund. The combined principal and interest payments come out to exactly $8,500 a month, starting this afternoon." The Mont Blanc pen clattered against the glass coffee table. All the color drained from Christopher's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. Elizabeth froze in horror, her mouth agape, before shrieking that I was a demonic witch trying to ruin her son's life with fake debts. Tyler and Ashley didn't even wait to hear the rest. Terrified of being dragged into a $1.2 million financial liability, they frantically grabbed their diaper bags and fled the estate in a panic, leaving Christopher standing alone in total suffocating silence. Packing up 5 years of marriage took less than 20 minutes. Standing in the quiet sanctuary of the master bedroom while Christopher slept off his cheap beer, I pulled a single Toomey carry-on from the back of the closet. In reality, this 4,000 square foot villa was filled with items I had painstakingly curated: custom ceramics, high thread count linens, and rare wine vintages. But as I zipped the leather case, I realized how little I actually needed. I packed my United States passport, my MBA degrees from Stanford, my set of custom sommelier tasting knives, my daily ulcer medication, and a framed photograph of my late parents. Everything else, the Italian leather sectional, the imported French oak barrels, the wedding albums, was left behind. Not because I didn't care, but because I refused to carry anything into my future that bore the stain of Christopher's family. Many people view leaving a toxic marriage as a form of abandonment or failure. Society conditions women to believe that loyalty means enduring endless disrespect, and that walking away makes you the traitor. But severing ties with abusive, parasitic bloodlines is not betrayal. It is an act of ultimate self-preservation and moral alignment. When a family views your generosity as an entitlement and your boundaries as an insult, stepping away is the only way to reclaim your dignity and align with your true self-worth. At 8:45 a.m., I walked into the glass-walled conference room of Title Guarantee Company in downtown Napa. Caldwell, my broker, was already pouring espresso alongside a wealthy international cash buyer and his legal counsel. They reviewed the premarital trust addendums, confirmed 0 existing liens on the 15-acre estate, and executed the wire transfer. Within 15 minutes, A push notification from my banking app confirmed that $1,800,000 in liquid cash had cleared directly into a brand new, isolated sole proprietor bank account. By 10 o'clock a.m., I sat across from attorney Richard at his law firm. I handed him the cleared escrow wire statement and signed the formal contested divorce petition, along with an emergency restraining order. Finally, I slid the encrypted USB drive containing the 4K security footage of Christopher striking my face across his mahogany desk. Richard plugged it in, watched the exact frame where Christopher's hand made contact with my jaw, and locked eyes with me. "He is a dead man walking in the California courts," Richard said quietly. "I will handle the bloodbath. Maintain radio silence." By 3 o'clock p.m., the wheels of my Uber hummed against the pavement as I arrived at San Francisco International Airport. I cleared TSA pre-check with icy composure and walked into the International Lounge. Sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac, I pulled out my iPhone, popped open the SIM tray, and removed the carrier card. Just as I did, a final text message from Christopher flashed across the screen. "Come home tonight. Don't cross the line. Where is the Range Rover?" I stared at his words, typed out a single sentence in response, and hit send. "Stay home tonight and welcome the guests." The second the message delivered, I snapped the plastic SIM card cleanly in half and tossed the pieces into a lounge trash can. Moments later, I handed my boarding pass to the gate agent and stepped onto British Airways Flight 295. 10 hours later, the aircraft pierced through the heavy morning mist over France, touching down smoothly at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. A corporate driver met me at arrivals and navigated the pristine historic streets to my Mayfair-style corporate townhome. I unlocked the heavy iron door, stepped into the master bathroom, and turned on the rainfall shower. As the scalding water hit my skin, dissolving the California airport grime and washing the lingering nightmare of Napa Valley straight down the drain, I felt weightless. Wrapped in a plush bathrobe, I sat by the window overlooking the mist rising off the Seine River. I booted up my laptop, activated my new European phone line, and initiated a FaceTime call to my parents. My father's face appeared on the screen, his eyes instantly catching the faint yellow residue of the bruise on my cheekbone. Before I could even apologize for selling the street, Helena estate, my father spoke, his voice carrying the force of an absolute anchor. "Sweetheart, we didn't buy that estate to be a tomb or a museum piece. We bought it to be your armor. If selling it bought your permanent freedom from those parasites, then it served its exact purpose. Take a deep breath. You are free." While my flight soared across the Atlantic Ocean, back at the Street Helena estate in Napa Valley, the psychological trap I set was detonating with surgical precision. At 6:30 p.m., Christopher was pacing back and forth across my living room rug, nursing a cheap beer and trying to convince himself that my morning disclosure was nothing more than an elaborate bluff. Sitting on my leather couch, Elizabeth was busily scribbling out a $3,000 shopping list on a legal pad, itemizing nursery gear, organic formula, and high-end air purifiers she still expected me to purchase. They had spent the entire afternoon marinating in their own entitlement, reasoning that a high-earning corporate executive like me would never actually walk away from a luxury property. Christopher insisted that I had simply concocted the debt to test his patriarchal authority and see if he had the spine to command the household. At exactly 7 p.m., a sharp chime echoed through the quiet villa. Expecting me to walk through the front door defeated, ready to apologize and hand over bank statements, Christopher adjusted his collar and swaggered to the foyer to lay down the law. But when he pulled open the heavy wooden door, he was met not by his humbled wife, but by a wall of absolute corporate authority. Standing on the porch was a sharply dressed corporate legal representative holding a leather portfolio, flanked by 2 armed Napa County Sheriff deputies and a full commercial moving crew carrying industrial packing boxes. The representative didn't waste a single second. He flipped open his folder and presented certified copies of the stamped warranty deed of sale, alongside verified wire transfer receipts. He calmly informed Christopher that Miss Samantha Kensington had executed a unilateral cash liquidation of the 15-acre real estate, and per the binding escrow agreement, physical possession of the premises took effect immediately tonight. Hearing the commotion, Elizabeth waddled into the foyer, her face flushed with outrage, as she shrieked that any sale was completely illegal because the property carried a $1.2 million home equity loan. The legal representative looked at her with clinical disdain and replied that title searches and bank audits confirmed zero liens or encumbrances on the ledger. The title was 100% clean, and the transaction had cleared for $1.8 million in liquid cash earlier that morning. That single sentence hit Christopher like a physical blow. A wave of nauseating horror washed over him as the brutal truth settled in. There was no debt. There was no $1.2 million loan and no $8,500 monthly payment. The entire financial liability had been a psychological stress test, and his own spineless cowardice had caused him to flinch, forfeiting an unencumbered $2.8 million estate out of pure terror. When men build their sense of authority on a partner's wealth rather than their own internal character, they inhabit an illusion of power. They mistake financial generosity for weakness, strutting around like kings until the underlying foundation is suddenly removed. The instant the financial engine walks away, their unearned status collapses into pathetic powerlessness. When Christopher threw a tantrum and refused to vacate, the Napa County Sheriff deputies stepped forward, informing him that as an individual with no legal title, no lease agreement, and zero co-ownership status, he was legally an active trespasser on private property. Within minutes, the commercial movers systematically swept through the master suite, dumping Christopher's clothes into cardboard boxes while neighbors pulled up in their driveways along street Helena Highway to watch the public humiliation unfold. Moments later, an Uber pulled into the circular driveway. Tyler and Ashley stepped out to hastily retrieve their abandoned diaper bags before getting caught in a legal nightmare. Desperate and weeping, Elizabeth grabbed Tyler's arm and begged to sleep on their floor for a few days. But Tyler coldly pulled his arm away, stating that his 500-square-foot studio apartment had absolutely no space to host homeless relatives, leaving his mother weeping on the concrete. At 9:15 p.m., as Christopher sat on the curb surrounded by black garbage bags filled with his clothes, his cell phone buzzed. It was his company's HR director informing him that he was terminated effective immediately after Oakstone Winery formally canceled their primary logistics contract with his firm. The director warned that the company-leased Range Rover he was driving was registered to my private entity, and that a repossession agency was currently en route to retrieve the vehicle under threat of grand theft auto charges. Stripped of his home, his job, his car, and his wife's fortune in less than 12 hours, Christopher sat under the dark California sky, staring at the glowing red smart lock of a villa he no longer owned. 3 months after stepping off that flight, my life in France had blossomed into something extraordinary. As the managing director of a historic Bordeaux estate, I woke up every morning to rolling green vineyards bathed in golden sunlight instead of the suffocating tension of my old home. My focus was sharp, my leadership unquestioned, and my executive team operated with absolute precision. That Friday afternoon, as a torrential downpour battered the floor-to-ceiling glass of our corporate headquarters, I officially closed an $8.5 million international distribution contract with Sterling Global. My executive board sent a glowing commendation to my desk, and for the first time in my career, I felt the pure, unadulterated joy of an accomplishment achieved entirely on my own merit. While I was building my empire in France, back in California, Christopher and Elizabeth were drowning in the consequences of their own creation. Having lost the estate, his job, and the corporate vehicle, Christopher had exhausted his meager savings within weeks. He and Elizabeth ended up renting a single, cramped room in a $60 a night motel off Interstate 80, surrounded by peeling paint and the smell of stale bleach. Tyler and Ashley had completely ghosted them, refusing to share their 500-square-foot studio apartment. Driven to total insanity by his own public humiliation and financial ruin, Christopher took out a high-interest payday loan, purchased a cheap economy ticket, and flew across the Atlantic in a desperate, frantic bid to ambush me. As I packed my briefcase to head home, my desk phone buzzed. Reception informed me that an unkempt American man was in the lobby demanding to see his wife. I took the executive elevator down, stepping out into the cavernous expanse of white marble and glass. Standing near the entrance was Christopher. He looked emaciated and completely broken, wearing a wrinkled, damp suit with muddy sneakers, his beard overgrown and his eyes sunken deep into his skull. The second he saw me in my tailored suit, tears spilled over his lower lids. He lunged forward, but 2 massive corporate security guards instantly stepped into his path. Christopher dropped straight to his knees right there on the freezing marble floor, clutching his hands together in a desperate prayer. "Samantha, please," he sobbed, his voice echoing loudly through the lobby. "I was wrong. I was a monster. I am dying without you, living in a motel with my mom. Look at me. I am paying you back." Suddenly, he raised his right hand and violently slapped himself across the face. The sharp smack echoed off the high ceiling. He hit himself a second time, harder, and then a third time, until his own lip split and blood trickled down his chin. "Look, Samantha, I bled for you," he wept, begging on his knees. "Will you please forgive me now? Just let me be your husband again." I stood 3 feet away, staring down at him with clinical detachment. Tears that arrive only after the money gets cut off are not a sign of a broken heart. They are merely the frantic thrashing of a parasite that lost its host. "You claim you love me, Christopher," I said, my voice slicing through the cold air. "All right, let us test that love with 3 simple questions. Question 1. What specific food ingredient am I so violently allergic to that even the slightest trace in my food causes anaphylactic shock and requires an EpiPen?" Christopher blinked stupidly, sweat beading on his forehead. "Shellfish?" he stammered. "Peanuts?" "Incorrect," I replied softly. "It is truffle oil, the very fries your mother insisted on bringing into my home while telling me I was being dramatic." Question 2. What daily prescription medication do I take to keep my severe stomach ulcers from flaring up? His eyes darted wildly. "Advil? Pink capsules?" he guessed frantically. I reached into my coat pocket and dropped a blister pack onto the marble floor in front of his knees. Omeprazole, the medication I swallowed every night while you stepped right over my body to grab the television remote. Question 3. The night my mother was rushed to the emergency room after suffering a stroke, where were you while I sat alone in the ICU corridor? Christopher hung his head, his vocal cords failing him completely. "You were at a sports bar in downtown San Francisco with your friends, texting me to stop acting like a psycho stalker because my calls were embarrassing you," I enunciated coldly. "You scream that you love me, yet you have no idea what could kill me, what medication keeps me functioning, or where you were when my mother almost died. The only things you remember with photographic clarity are my salary, my title, and my bank account." I pulled a thick manila envelope from my leather folder and tossed it onto the floor beside his bleeding lip. Inside are the finalized divorce petitions and restraining orders. I turned to security and gave a sharp directive. "Escort this individual off the premises. If he steps foot near this building again, have the authorities arrest him immediately." The security guards hauled Christopher to his feet and physically dragged him through the revolving doors, shoving him out into the pouring rain. He pressed his bleeding hands against the glass, screaming my name into the storm, but I turned my back and walked toward the elevator without looking back a single time. That evening, I permanently blocked his last burner email address, cutting his existence out of my life forever. 2 weeks later, the final court mediation took place via a secure Zoom link with the Napa County Family Court. Attorney Richard presented the 4K Nest video footage of the physical assault, alongside comprehensive forensic financial audits. The judge reviewed the evidence with absolute disgust toward the defense, formally granting the dissolution of marriage, cementing my $1.8 million in liquid proceeds as exclusive, separate premarital property, and completely denying Christopher's pathetic plea for spousal support due to his documented domestic battery. When the judge's gavel banged on the screen, it was over. The legal ties were permanently severed, and Christopher was left with 0 alimony, 0 assets, and a criminal record. Many people believe that revenge is about destroying the people who hurt you, watching them suffer, or lingering in the wreckage of past battles. But true justice is something far more profound. True justice is the act of personal resurrection, stepping away from the ashes of a toxic dynamic, enforcing unbreakable boundaries, and cultivating a life so abundant, meaningful, and peaceful that the memory of your abusers becomes utterly irrelevant. When you stop pouring your energy into defending yourself against parasites, you reclaim the power to build an empire of your own. This morning, the rain finally cleared over Bordeaux, leaving a crisp, brilliant autumn sun glowing across the valley. I walked through the golden vines of my vineyard estate, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, holding a crystal glass of Grand Cru. My heart was calm, my mind was silent, and my soul was weightless. I took a slow sip of the rich wine, tilted my head toward the bright French sky, and smiled. I was no longer a victim surviving a war. I was a woman who had reclaimed her worth, rebuilt her world, and stepped into her absolute power, fully and unconditionally at peace. Thank you for watching. If Samantha's story inspired you to stand up for your worth and set unbreakable boundaries, please like, share, and subscribe to Revenge Us for more powerful stories of justice.